Okay, so welcome to the Discovering Buddhism, and well, what is it? The third evening on the Kaza, discovering the path, right? So the model on the path. Yeah. So yeah, and because we're talking about the path, that last time we talked about the three scopes of the Lamrim, right? The scope of the, wanting to have a precious human rebirth, the scope of, wanting to achieve nirvana, and the scope of wanting to achieve the state of enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. So try to generate a motivation for yourself in relation with either of those three scopes. Yeah. So think that you're here together to discussing the paths for that purpose, right? Either achieving a precious human rebirth or nirvana, or most superior aspect of Buddhahood yourself, to liberate all sentient beings. Yeah. So generate correct motivation for yourself. Okay, and then we do a few prayers, and then think that in front of yourself, Sakyamuni Buddha, surrounded by the masters of India and Tibet, and surrounding yourself, countless sentient beings, yeah, and then think about the suffering of sentient beings and not able to bear the suffering of them, and take refuge in the field in front, to give you the potential to develop yourself to help those beings, right? So that's what we try to do, yeah. So based on that kind of intention, we recite the prayers. To praise Sakyamuni Buddha and the praise perfection, wisdom, and refuge. Yeah.
To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Indescribable, inconceivable, and inexpressible perfection of wisdom, unproduced, unceasing, the nature of space, object of the uniquely knowing transcendental wisdom, to the mother of the victorious ones of the three times, I prostrate. Tayata gate gate, paragate, parasamgate, bodhisoha. Tayata gate gate, paragate, parasamgate, bodhisoha. Tayata gate gate, paragate, parasamgate, bodhisoha.
Sangye Chodam Soni Tsonam La Janjo Badu Dani Yazuji Dagi Chizu Gibe Sonangi Dola Penje Sangye Doba Sho Sangye Chodam Soni Tsonam Janjo Badu Dani Yazuji Dagi Chizu Gibe Dola Penje Sangye Doba Sho Sangye Chodam Soni Tsonam Janju Badu Dani Gyazu Ji Dagi Jushi Gibes Dola Penshi Sangye Do Basho. Yeah, so last time we talked about the precious human rebirth, like a vessel. Arya Nagarjuna described it as a vessel with 18 jewels on it, So if you have a vessel with 18 jewels, then you can use them, right? You use the vessel or the 18 jewels to take, that's a reference to the 18 freedoms and endowments, so to say, So if you just use it as a waste bin, then, if you have a vessel of gold with jewels, 18 jewels on top of it, and you use it as to put your waste in, then people consider you are stupid, right? Because you want to use the wealth of that particular vessel to have fun or to enjoy life, so that means that from a worldly perspective, people think you're crazy if you just use it as a garbage can. Yeah. So in a similar way, if you don't use this precious human rebirth, we consider it as crazy. Yeah, as Shantideva says, wake up, don't sleep, you fool. Use this vessel. You can all the way go to the shore beyond samsaric ocean of liberation and enlightenment, So yeah, that's one thing we discussed last time. And then, because the opportunity we have right now is not going to last forever. Yeah, as we also discussed a little bit last time that, death and impermanence is a very important topic to be contemplated, The Buddha said, among all four-footers, so that refers to animals, right? Animals, they walk on four. Human beings are being considered as two-footers, just for your knowledge. So animals are considered as four-footers. So among all four-footers, the biggest one, and the most superior one, so to say, is the elephant, And then among all discriminations or meditations, the most superior one is the meditation on death and impermanence. Yeah? So that's kind of a very important meditation. Why? Because it helps us to motivate ourselves, to see that, the opportunity we have now is not going to last forever, And meditation on death and impermanence is done for a particular purpose, right? It's not to make us depressed or kasa or down or I met a person once, he said, I can die any moment, so there's no point in doing anything anymore because I can die any moment. So that's also not really the meaning of meditating on death and impermanence, right? The meaning is to take the essence of this precious human rebirth while we still have it, So that means that you contemplate that, death, there will be a separate model on death and impermanence itself, but to make the path complete, right? So we talked about last time, we first have to see we have this very precious kind of opportunity, right? The vessel of the precious human rebirth with all the freedoms and endowments and freedoms to study and practice and not have too many wrong views and not have a little bit faith in the possibility of changing the mind, etc., as we discussed last time, So that that should motivate us. And then seeing that this opportunity is not lasting forever. Lama Tsongkhapa, in his lines of experience, it says, like lightning, like that. That means that it can be over any time. And if you think about our life, the first 20 years of our life, we just occupied by growing up, right? Almost nobody thinks about spirituality in the first 20 years. Then the next 20 years is kind of try to enjoy life the best thing you can, right? And then the next 20 years is kind of, spirituality later, when I'm old, or when I have more time. And then the last 20 years of your life, you think, it's too late now, right? So that's average a person that, in relation with If you don't think about death and impermanence, that will happen. You will just say later, not today. You know, might as well enjoy life another day. And before you know it, you're almost dying. Yeah. So that's why we have to contemplate death and impermanence, to motivate ourselves, not to make us depressed, but to motivate ourselves. And the more you contemplate death and impermanence, the more spiritual actually you become, right? And we see that in the research on the near-death experience, that the majority of the people who have experienced, being close to death, this near-death experience, that the majority becomes very spiritual, becomes more compassionate, sees more things in developing the mind rather than developing material things, So yeah, that's true, So that means that if you contemplate death and impermanence, it will move you into the direction of spirituality, and in particular, in this context, into the path, of the lamrim, of the stages of the path to enlightenment. So then you contemplate, just in short, we come in more detail later on, but in short, there are 3 points to contemplate, right? That death is definite, meaning you cannot escape, you cannot escape death. You cannot go to an island, you cannot go to a doctor, you cannot go anywhere or depend on any medication or any location that prevents you from dying. There's no possibility to prevent yourself from dying. So as soon as you're born, actually you walk towards death, right? So that's what it means, So there's no way you can escape it, So that's kind of why we say death is definite, So that's a guarantee. You don't have to sign a paper for that. As soon as you're born, you know you're gonna die one day, right? And then the second point to contemplate is that the time of death is very uncertain. Death is certain, but the time when we die is very uncertain. Why is it so uncertain? Because when you come to this planet, they don't give you a kind of guarantee that you live for 80 years or you live for 90 years. That doesn't happen, with your birth certificate together. It doesn't happen, right? So that means is you don't know how long you're gonna stay, right? That's because at this time in this planet, some people die young, some people die old, some people die in between, some people die at time of birth, some people die before birth, some die before the parents. There's no guarantee, right? It's not always the parents die first and then you, right? It happens the other way around as well, So there's no guarantee, So death is very uncertain because of that. And also, the time of death is very uncertain, So the first point is death is definite, is to contemplate because there's no escape. You cannot escape it. And you're walking towards death, right? And you cannot really finish all your projects before you die. That also is not possible. So that means death is definite. That's the first point to contemplate. The second point to contemplate is the time of death being uncertain, because it's no guarantee when you're born you get this amount of years, right? So the time of death is uncertain because there's no guarantee. Then there's more conditions that cause you to die than to sustain life, right? So when you're sick, you can, then medication and operation, this, that, but then there's complications, and certain medications, they have side effects, and then, you get something better in one part of the body, but then the liver gets harmed, or so that means there's so many more conditions that causes death rather than that sustains life. And that's even true for medication, right? So that's another point, that the time of death is uncertain. And another point, third point, is that, our body is like a water bubble, it's very easy to pop. Not completely pop the whole body, but that one organ stops, and then the other organ failure, and before you know, you die, right? So the body is very, if you wake up in the morning and you see the complicated system is still working, it's quite something, Yeah. It's, if you really see how complex the body is, then it's a miracle it's all working. My mother, who is now, what is it, 78 or something like that. So she doesn't consider herself as a Buddhist, but her son is, dressed up, and not only dressed up like this, but actually he's a fully ordained monk. So then my mom, she reads, because I'm not completely stupid, she knows that. So she knows I have a particular reason to become a monk, right? So she reads a little bit. And then she says also, yeah, it's true. It's so fortunate and a miracle that it's all working every day. It's true, right? The body is quite a complex system. So it's very easy to get sickness, so also here, that's why we now 100%, how to say, online only today, because we have a few staff members who got this kind of Mr. COVID in the body, and that caused them to suffer and not be able to mix with others, and that's why we do online only today, right? Yeah, so that means it's very easy to get sick, but then it's possible to get all kind of complications, and you can die, right? So that's very easy to die. Yeah, our body is very, very fragile, Yeah, so there's a second meditation. Time of death is uncertain, right? We don't know the moment when we die. Yeah, so we can die. We think when we go to bed, we think we wake up tomorrow, isn't it? That we think we wake up tomorrow. But actually, if the next life comes earlier or tomorrow, that's a question, right? Yeah. So that means that, it's no certainty we wake up tomorrow. You see, or people in a conversation they just collapse, or it's many stories like that. Yeah. So the time of death is uncertain. Yeah. And then point number 3 to contemplate is that at the time of death, only our mental development, or in the Buddhist context, only the Dharma is of benefit. Because when you die, you leave behind your friends, your family, even your own body you have to leave behind, and your possessions. The only thing that goes is your mind. Yeah, even if you have billions, maybe not billions, but let's say millions of followers on your social media, they don't follow you when you die, right? You all go alone, right? So you come alone and you go alone, right? So that means that what is most important when you die is not to have millions of followers on social media or something like that. The main thing is your own development of the mind, right? Yeah, so that's kind of the most important aspect when you die, because that goes from this to the next life, and that actually puts forward what kind of rebirth you're going to be in. Yeah, so that depends on your mental development. Yeah, and in the studies of children remembering previous lifetimes, yeah, when Stevenson, the Professor Stevenson from the University of Virginia, he did this incredible research, and he says there's something that carries information from a previous personality to the present, right? So that we say the continuity of consciousness. Yeah. So the continuity of consciousness carries all our habituation patterns. Yeah. So also in those studies, you see habituation patterns carry on from one life to the next, which is very interesting, very, very interesting from the Buddhist perspective. So if you look at those kind of case studies, yeah, of children remembering previous lifetimes. So then we see if habituation patterns carry on, then if you develop your mind, also that carries on. Yeah, so that means if we develop our mind well now, it's not lost when we die, because it carries on to the next life. And also at the time of death, there is kind of benefit, So that's why we have to prepare for that, it's good. Yeah, okay. So that means we see we're going to die, there's no escape, and when it's uncertain, And what should we do is to prepare our mind. Yeah, so that's quite important. And to talk about death and impermanence is very healthy, you know. That's why there's this movements of what we call the death cafe. In the early days, people said, what? Death and impermanence? Put it in the corner. Don't talk about it. You don't talk about those things, right? But when you then meet that, then it's very difficult because you never thought about it. So if you want to avoid reality, that's not very clever, because you will meet reality. Yeah. So as Carlo Rovelli, a very world-renowned physicist, he says in his book on time, he says, fear for death is a fault in evolution. Why would you fear something that is a reality? Which is a very interesting statement. Why should you fear something that's a reality? You know, there's no point in fearing it, because the fear is not going to be of any benefit, right? And you know, we don't like to think about it, but if you don't think about it, when it comes, it's very difficult. Acceptance is very difficult. You know, when a family member or friend passes away and you never prepared your mind, it's very difficult. You know, so that's also my own mother, because, you know, she thought about these things for quite some time. Then when my father passed away quite quickly, when he had cancer, then she could deal with it so well. Sadness was there, but, you know, there was no depression, which was many of my aunts and uncles and friends were very amazed how my mother was dealing with it. So then I asked her later on, how did you do that? And she said, you know, can happen, right? So she thought about it before, she said, many times. So then when it happens, there's an acceptance, right? So when you understand the reality and you meet that reality, you can accept it, right? And then when you can accept it, there's less mental suffering, you know? So that's why we consider the contemplations of death and impermanence as a very healthy aspect, because it's in accordance with reality. Yeah? Every state of mind that is not in accordance with reality causes suffering. Yeah? We saw that in the first model with destructive emotions being not in accordance with reality, right? Anger overestimates the faults. Attachment overestimates the qualities, and then we believe that's reality, and that's why we end up in kind of aversion to some people, or we don't get any satisfaction because we have too many expectations which are not reality. And then, so that means that the destructive emotions are minds that are not in accordance with reality. Yeah, the same for depression, low self-esteem, anxiety, fear, you know, what people, yeah, in the Western society, that means that those states of mind are not in accordance with reality. Or worry. We worry about things, don't we? Yeah, we worry about so much, but actually 95% or something like that of what we worry about will never happen. But we just worry about it because we worry about things. Yeah, so that's also not in accordance with reality, right? So that means every state of mind that is not in accordance with reality is basically a cause for suffering. Yeah? So that's why it's good to contemplate death and impermanence, because that's a reality. You know, if you don't contemplate it and put it in the corner, then when it comes, it's quite difficult. You know, so if you prepare your mind, then it's easy, and you can even joke about it. That's why we always do that in Buddhist context. Okay, don't die between today and next Thursday, okay? Then we can move on. So we joke about those things in Buddhism quite often. But at the same time, we contemplate it, right? So that's kind of a very important aspect of death and impermanence. Okay, so then you die, okay? You die, and then you can go in various states of existence, you know? So if you die and you go to lower states of existence, like animal or spirits, something like that, you know, it's very difficult, you know. So why is it so difficult? Because, you know, if you tell a dog or a cat, change your mind, then what will happen? The dog and the cat don't have a clue what you're talking about. Yeah. So for an animal, it's very difficult to train the mind. Of course, they can learn things like, some certain dogs, very nice to see. They guide blind people, right? Yeah, so they can train, they can go to school, and train it that way. But to train the mind to reduce anger and to reduce attachment and to generate compassion and love and kindness is very difficult, right? In the animal realm, that's not really possible. So that means if you're born in those states of existence, then it's very complex, Yeah, so then the question is, can you be born in those states of existence? Yeah, that's the kind of a question, and that you have to analyze for yourself. Don't believe what Tenzin Namdak is saying, but check. Because if you observe animals, they have very similar kind of emotions, right? They have similar emotions like anger or strong desire, especially if you analyze wild animals, or street dogs in India, I find very interesting, or monkeys, You can see the desire after the females, the male after the female, for example, and then the fighting, between the males, kind of anger. So there's very similar forms of emotions, right? But also constructive ones, right? Compassion is also present, you see sometimes in the animal realm, right? So that means that their minds are limited because of the life they have. It's very limited, So then if you're born in those states, then it's very difficult. It's very difficult to progress, Most animals, they only create more negative karma, especially in the wild, eating each other and those kind of things, So create more negative karma rather than, progressing on the spiritual path. So then you think, oh, I have to be careful and I don't want to be born in those states. Yeah, so we're talking about the spiritual path. Yeah. So then you think, I need the same precious human rebirth as I have right now. Yeah. So then what you do, you fear. And there's a constructive form of fear, meaning you understand the suffering of the lower realms, as we just talked about the animal realm, to a certain extent, right? Eating each other, and then heat and cold, hunger and thirst, and sometimes the animals being exploited, So yeah, there's a lot of suffering there. So that means you contemplate that by thinking yourself in that state, and then generate a wish not to be born there, Yeah, so that's kind of, then you generate a wish not to be born there, and instead of be born there, you generate a wish to be born as we have right now, a precious human rebirth. So what you do, you have to create two causes for precious human rebirth. Yeah, so that's important to know. How do you create the causes for precious human rebirth? So that's what meaning that you have to practice morality. Yeah, so you have to practice morality, and morality means promising not to harm others. That's the meaning of morality, right? Morality means you don't engage in harming others with a particular promise. Yeah? So that means that you don't act in the act of killing, for example, killing other beings, or stealing others' possessions, or sexual misconduct, right? You don't engage in this negative behavior of the body. Yeah? So that means that when you avoid this negative behavior, you prevent yourself from creating causes for the lower states of existence. Yeah? So you try not to kill, you try not to steal, and you try not to engage in sexual misconduct that harms self and others, right? Yeah, so that's kind of how we do that from the point of view of the body. Yeah, no killing, no stealing, and no sexual misconduct. Yeah. Then also from the point of the speech, we also try to behave in a correct way. Yeah, so that means we try to avoid speech that is harmful to others. Yeah, such as lying, right? If you lie, you deceive a person. Yeah, and lying is mostly done to benefit yourself, and to deceive another person, right? So you try to avoid act of lying, yeah? And then on top of that, you also try to avoid what we call slander, yeah? Slander meaning if two friends go along well, right? Two friends go along well, or more friends, they have an harmonious relationship with each other, you know? And then you go in between and you try to separate them. Yeah, that's very harmful, you know, to separate people who will go along very well. You talk with one person, don't talk with person A because person A is like this, you know? And you go to person B and you say to the person, no, you go to person A and you say, yeah, sorry, Kiko. I look at Kiko and then I know I'm not doing the right thing. Sometimes out of my mouth comes something different than my mind. Yeah, so I look at Kiko and I will know exactly if it's going the right direction. Yeah. So that means that you go to person, so A and B, person A and B, they're two friends, right? So you go to person A and you say, don't hang out with person B because person B is like this, you know, which is a lie. Yeah. Then you go to person B and you say, don't hang out with person A because that person A is like that, you know. So you try to, you know, separate the two people, right? So that's kind of a negative aspect of the speech, you know. Yeah. Then that's another one. Then another negative aspect of the speech is harmful speech, you know, or scolding people with, you know, with the F word or you know, what else do we have? Yeah. We have so many words we can harm another person or scold a person because, you know, in a monastery, we don't, yeah, no, no, I don't say that, yeah. Delete that one, yeah. You know, so that would we do out of a joke, right, not with harmful intent. So if a person is bald, you say bald guy, or when a person is gray, you say gray guy, or gray woman, or you know, to actually cause a person to feel unhappy, right? That's the meaning behind harmful, you know, this aspect of harmful speech, of scolding a person. You know, the person is hurt by that, so you try to avoid that. Yeah, yeah. So that's another aspect of the speech. Yeah, number 3, and then number 4 is, you know, wasting your time in just talking about paella, or wasting your time and talking about pizza, or wasting your time talk about, you know, who's the new PM, Prime Minister, yeah, in the UK. Yeah, this kind of, Boris said goodbye to everybody, and now somebody else is coming. So let's see how that develops. Yeah, so yeah, in Spain, I don't know. I'm not really aware of the politics in Spain. But yeah, you probably have similar people, right? Yeah, so that means that if you just talk about it all the time, it's not very constructive, right? If you talk about, you know, the politics again and again, unless it's your job and you have to, you know. But if you just talk about over a cup of tea with somebody because you don't know anything else to do, so let's talk about politics or something like that, right? So it's kind of what we consider as senseless talk. Yeah, so that also harms self and others from the point of view of wasting time. Yeah. Okay, so that's that's 3 of the body, right? Killing, stealing, and sexual misconduct, right? And there's the 4 of the speech, as we just indicated, of lying, right? Slander, harmful, how would I say that? Harmful, yeah, not harmful intent, harmful speech, maybe, I don't know. Yeah, scolding a person, right? And then this senseless talk, you know? Yeah. So that's the 4 of the speech, and there is the 3 of the mind, yeah? Covetousness, you know, to wanting an object so well that you can't sit still anymore because you need this object. Yeah, so this is kind of a very strong attachment to food or an object you see online or in the shop, and you can't sleep anymore because you want to have this object, you know? Yeah. So that's kind of covetousness, right? The kind of strong attachment of wanting to have a particular object. Yeah. And that causes disturbance of yourself, right? Yeah. So what we just talked about, the 3 of the body and the 4 of the speech are in relation with harming others. Yeah, yeah. So you prevent yourself from harming others in that way. Yeah, so the Buddha said, you know, if you can benefit others, at least try not to harm them. Yeah, so that's the aspect of morality. Yeah. And then you can also harm yourself with the mind, with this covetousness, you know, being so disturbed that you want to have this or that based on a strong attachment. Yeah. That's one aspect. Then the other aspect is you know, strong aversion or harmful intent, yeah, or wish to harm another being. Yeah. I'm gonna get this person tomorrow because what that person said today is not correct. You know, the person criticized you, you know the feeling? So you think, I'm gonna get this person tomorrow, I'm gonna prepare what I'm gonna say. Yeah. So there's kind of to harm the person, right? There's kind of a harmful intent. Yeah. So you prevent that because you harm, yeah, yourself with that mind, you know, and that can lead to harming others later on, yeah, because the mind motivates physical or verbal behaviors. Yeah, so you don't engage into that. And then the last one is, you know, this stupid ignorance we're going to talk about many times coming up, that, you know, misunderstandings of reality, that also we just talked about. Every state of mind that doesn't understand reality is a cause for suffering, right? So that means that we have to understand reality eventually. Yeah. So that's kind of what we called about the 10, we just summarized the 10 non-virtues. Yeah, that means the 3 of the body, 4 of the speech, and 3 of the mind. Yeah, so yeah, so that means if you abandon these 10 non-virtues, you practice morality, right? And that's actually the cause for presumed rebirth. You know, because, you know, the Buddha is very skillful. You know, when you contemplate the various sufferings of samsara, okay, and then you go to the Buddha and say, look, Buddha, I don't want this suffering anymore. What should I do? You know what the Buddha says? You know, there's a continuity of law of cause and effect within our continuum, right? So we have dependent origination everywhere around us, you know? Yeah. So I always, so for example, you know, the flower here is, I don't know what it is. Yeah? Ali is a fake one. You sure? It looks very real. Yeah, now I see it's fake. Yeah. Anyway, it looks real to you, right? Yeah. But just imagine it's a real one. Yeah. Okay. So that means that a flower comes about by the power of a seed, and that seed needs moisture and heat and fertilization, and then it grows into a plant, right? That's how a plant grows. That's law of cause and effect, right? In the external world. So that means there are causes, there are conditions, and there are results. Yeah? So that means a seed you plant, then the conditions of heat, moisture, fertilization comes, and then it grows into a plant. You know, so that's cause and effect relationships. Yeah, so that's nothing is random. Everything is depending on causes and conditions. Yeah, so that's in the external world the case, and that's true with the weather. You know that it depends on many causes and conditions. Yeah, but inside our continuity of consciousness, there is also a world of cause and effect relationships, right? So inside our continuity of consciousness, the world of cause and effect relationships is what we call karma. Yeah? Karma is not something magical. Karma is not something invented by the Buddha. Karma is a law of reality, of cause and effect relationships. For example, when you get angry, then you have a disturbance of the mind, right? The mind becomes unpeaceful, as we call it. You know? So that means anger produces suffering, right? That's also a very simplified aspect of karma. Cause and effect relationships within your continuity of consciousness. Yeah? So then you help another person you know, you sit down, a person has an issue in life, you sit down, you listen, and then you discuss, and then you give some advice, and the person benefits from that. Then you feel like satisfied a little bit after that. You know, oh, nice, I was able to help this person. Yeah, so that means that with compassion or love and kindness, it produces kind of happiness, right? So that proves there is a cause and effect relationship within our continuity of consciousness, that effects of states of mind are caused by previous moments of consciousness, right? So there's a very simplified aspect of cause and effect relationships, you know. And then it gets more complex, the more factors that play a role. So, but within the continuity of consciousness, there is a cause and effect relationship, right? Yeah, you can relate to that with these kind of emotions, right? A positive emotion like compassion, love and kindness gives us a kind of uplifting state of mind, makes us a bit happy, right? And anger actually causes us to feel down or feel uncomfortable or feel unhappy. You know, so that means within our continuity of consciousness, there's a cause and effect relationship right there, you know. So that's what we call karma. We cannot change that anger produces suffering. That law we cannot change. In a similar way, we cannot change that fire is hot and burning. We cannot change that reality, right? But we can prevent our hand from putting it into the fire. You know? So the reality that fire is hot and burning, we cannot change. In a similar way with the Kaza, with the climate disaster, the more CO2 that comes into the atmosphere, it will heat up the planet. We cannot change that reality that the more CO2 there is, the planet becomes hotter. That's a law of reality we cannot change. But we can prevent ourselves from putting more CO2 in the atmosphere, right? You see that? So that the Buddha said, there are laws of reality we cannot change, right? Fire is hot and burning, the more CO2 in the atmosphere will heat up the planet. That law we cannot change, but we can play with conditions to prevent a disaster. Not putting your hand in the fire, of stopping to produce more CO2, right? So that means that we can play with causes and conditions. That's what the Buddha said. So okay, the Buddha said, you want a happy life? Okay, live in accordance with the law of cause and effect. Because anger produces suffering, so, you know, transform your mind and transform anger into patience, you know? Because you cannot prevent the law that anger produces suffering, but you can prevent anger from coming into being, right? So that's exactly what the Buddha advised. The Buddha had his insight in karma. The Buddha didn't make this law, it's just the Buddha observed this aspect of reality, you know? And that aspect of reality of karma we cannot change, cause and effect relationships, but we can play with causes and conditions to prevent certain states of mind from coming into being, you see? So then the Buddha said, okay, you want the precious human rebirth, so then don't engage in those 10 non-virtues, yeah, because it creates causes for suffering in the future. So that's because the karma, what we just explained, is a very simplified aspect, right? That anger produces suffering, love and kindness and compassion produces happiness. It's very simplified, but it becomes very complex because every moment of consciousness there's activity, right? We now listening and thinking, or maybe thinking what to eat after this, or we contemplate things, right? We think about things, and then that consciousness stops. But when it stops, it leaves a potential in our continuity of consciousness, right? So when you look at the screen, for example, yeah, and something to drink. When you look at the screen, then with your eyes, then you close your eyes, and then your eye consciousness seeing the screen stopped. because you close your eyes, right? But that doesn't mean that information of seeing the screen is gone. You can still remember it, right? So that means there is information still there. Yeah, so that's what we call imprints. So that means every activity, if it's physical, verbal or mental, it leaves a potential in the continuity of consciousness. Nothing is completely lost. So that means that every good things you do remains in a kind of potential in your continuity of consciousness. Every bad thing you do remains a potential in continuity of consciousness. So the good things will produce happiness and the bad things will produce suffering. Yeah, so that's kind of a very sophisticated law of reality, but it's very scientific if you really go into the details. Unfortunately, discovering Buddhism just talks about the main basic principle aspects. But if you go into details of the study of these potentials, what are these potentials, right? It becomes very scientific. Even when you talk with mainstream scientists, it starts to make a lot of sense. There is a cause and effect relationship, everything is interconnected, there's a law of cause and effect within the continuity of consciousness, right? So that means that the Buddha said, okay, you want to practice human rebirth, don't engage in the 10 non-virtues and practice the morality of abandoning the 10 non-virtues. Yeah, so don't act in killing, etc. And then that together with a prayer, may I become a Buddha for the benefit of all sentient beings, and for that purpose I need to practice human rebirth, then you activate that positive potential of practicing morality in a particular direction of achieving a presumed rebirth. Yeah, that's also cause and effect relationships, you know. So you actually create the right causes for a good rebirth, you know. Yeah. So that reality of karma is there. Cause and effect relationships, nothing is random, that's there. So you should live in accordance to that law, and then there's peace, you know. Yeah. So, yeah. Lama Zopa Rinpoche once said that when Vemba Roger asked Rinpoche to relax, you know, Lama Zopa Rinpoche never sleeps, right? Sometimes maybe 10, 15 minutes, but for the rest, 24/7, hard walking, you know. So then Vemba Roger said, oh, Rinpoche, actually, what does that mean to relax? Vemba Roger asked Rinpoche. Actually, it's in the podcast from yeah. Yeah. Anyway, so then Alejandro did a podcast, right? In Nagarjuna Madrid or by himself, I'm not sure. The podcast with Vemba Roger, and it's in there, you know. So you can listen probably when you like. So then, Casa, then Vemba Roger tried to find out what is relaxation for Rinpoche. Right? And then, you know what Rinpoche said? It was very moving. Living in pure morality is relaxation, which is very interesting. Because if you live in pure morality, you can take it easy. Why? Because you constantly create causes for happiness, you know? So, that's the real relaxation, right? We want to have relaxation from the point of view of happiness, right? That's what we want to get out of relaxation, is happiness, isn't it? So that means that if you live in pure morality, that creates causes for happiness, because you don't harm self and others. You prevent causes for suffering. So, because you prevent causes from suffering, and you practice something virtuous, then you actually create cause for happiness. Because practicing morality, meaning you abandon negative things for self and others, and because you're doing that, you actually do something virtue, meaning you create causes for happiness. So that's kind of the real form of relaxation, and you know, finding happiness is actually abiding in this morality. It's very interesting. Yeah, so that's the Buddha's advice that came after people asked the Buddha, what should I do to progress on the spiritual path and to get a precious rebirth again with all the right conditions? Then the Buddha said, practice morality, make a prayer, and then also engage in activities like generosity, right? Because if you engage in activities like generosity, you create the right causes and conditions for yourself to you need, right? Yeah, we need certain conditions in life to to progress. Yeah. So that's a little bit about what we call the small scope of the lamrim. Yeah, that means that you, in the small scope of the lamrim, you contemplate the suffering of the lower realms, like the animal realm, for example. You generate a wish not to be born there, and then you tell the Buddha, what should I do? And that's what we consider as taking refuge. We come to that in great detail later on, right? So then the Buddha said, okay, the advice after taking refuge, meaning you don't like particular suffering and you go in a safe direction not to experience that, right? So that's kind of what we call two causes of going for refuge. You fear a particular suffering you don't like, and you trust a particular mind training or particular teaching that helps you not to suffer in the future. Yeah, that means that there's two causes for refuge: is the fear for particular suffering, and the faith in a particular method that leads you beyond the suffering. Yeah, so that's why the Buddha said, okay, then take refuge in this way. Yeah, we come into great detail to refuge later on, but the meaning is refuge means a safe direction, right? So what is the safe direction? Then is kind of practicing the Dharma, right? That means eliminating causes for suffering and create causes for happiness, right? That's the real safe direction. Yeah, refuge has many levels, as we're going to discuss, but the real refuge is refuge or a safe direction in your own mind in the future to be free of afflictions. Your own mind in the future to be free of negative karma, right? Your own mind in the future to be free of all forms of destructive emotions. Your own mind to be always in peace, right? Or the peace of nirvana, or your own mind in the state of Buddhahood. Yeah, so yourself becoming a Buddha and taking a safe direction in that, in that aspect is the real refuge, right? That means if you take refuge simplified, meaning a safe direction in methods that helps you to become a happier human being. That's a very secular aspect of going for refuge, right? Because if we, the Buddha cannot save us. We can hold the Buddha by his hand, but he cannot help us, right? Directly. He cannot go with us to the future lifetime. Yeah, the Buddha cannot do that. The Buddha cannot protect us from getting sick, or the Buddha cannot, help us to eliminate our suffering, or the Buddha cannot give his realizations to us, but he can show us how to do it, right? That means the Buddha said, okay, if you want happiness, do this, meaning practice morality. And that's the real refuge, right? Our refuge is then, okay, I practice morality. That's the safe direction. And then your real refuge is, I'm going to apply the antidotes to the afflictions, right? So I become less angry, and then there's less suffering. That's the real refuge, right? And your own development of your mind in the future. Yeah, that's what we call resultant refuge. Yeah, we come to that in great detail later on, because there's one model on refuge. But here we just get the path clear, right? So that means you don't want to be born in difficult situations, so you want to take refuge in a method that helps you not to be born in difficult situations. And then the Buddha said, okay, the method for that is practicing morality. Yeah, so you practice morality, you make a prayer, and then you're born again as a human rebirth, and then with all these kind of freedoms and endowments. Yeah, okay. So that's what we call the small scope of the Lamrim, right? That you want to achieve a precious human rebirth in order to develop. Yeah, so that's what we consider it as a small scope of the Lamrim. Yeah. Then you're born again as a human, and then we already discussed previously that human life is not perfect. Or is it? I don't know. Maybe depends where you are. I don't know. Is it perfect or not? Do you have all the happiness you want already? Or not? You check. So that means that a human life we have is not perfect, right? Why it's not perfect? Because there's the suffering of birth, sickness, aging, death, meeting things we don't like to meet, and never meeting things we like to meet, and never finding any satisfaction. So that's summarized kind of 7 different types of suffering, right? That we have suffer when we born, you know, come out of womb, then it's not all that pleasant, you know. And then we grow up, and then you know the hassle of growing up, right? This kind of, and then yeah, sickness just happens to you beyond control, right? We don't want to get sick, but it just happens. Yeah. So yeah, you know that, right? So when you have a fever, or now with the COVID business, then you get COVID, and sometimes long COVID. So in 1 month or 2 months, you're just all the time tired, and then you have to cough, and then you don't want that because you want to do other things, but you cannot because the suffering of the sickness is there, and then you have to sleep more. So that means that it just happens to us, right? It happens to us beyond control. That's what I mean, you know. So all forms of suffering we undergo happens beyond control. Meaning, as long as you have karma and afflictions, you have to suffer. Yeah? So that's what we're gonna discuss in the middling scope. Yeah? So that's what I'm gonna talk about now for another, 15, 20 minutes. You know, the middling scope is about understanding the suffering of samsara and want to achieve nirvana. Yeah? So samsara is the cycle. You know, the cycle of birth, sickness, aging, and death, again and again and again and again and again, beyond control. Yeah, that's kind of what happens in samsara is beyond our control. You know, meaning when we're born in samsara, that happens beyond control. In a similar way, when we die. Oh, so first, before we die, first talk about the dream. Yeah. So when we dream, we never can say, oh, tonight I'm going to dream about this, and I'm going to do that, and I'm going to do this and that as well. You know, you try that, to do that? Did you succeed or not? You try it tonight, okay? You say, tonight I'm going to dream that I'm going to, you know, study the Dharma and meditate on it, and then get the realizations, yeah? So you try to do that tonight, okay? Then we talk again next week. Yeah. Or you try it every night. Yeah. But you will see that you're not in control, right? In the waking state, we have certain control, but in the dream state, it's very difficult, you know? So that means when you die, it's very similar, you know? It's just similar to falling asleep and then dreaming. Yeah. So that means there's not much control. And then for the time being, we all feel quite comfortable, right? It's a bit hot here and there, but for the rest, we're quite comfy. But when you get sick, then it completely changes, you know? And the sickness just happens to you when you don't want to get sick. It happens to you beyond control, right? So that means there are various aspects of life that happen to you beyond your control. And you don't want this aspect of life, you know. So that's kind of what we call, you know, contaminated life. Yeah. So contaminated means contaminated with karma and afflictions. As long as you have karma, so we just talked about karma a little bit. Karma is nothing else than the activities of emotions in relation with body, speech, and mind. Yeah. So we engage in all kind of aspects of physical behavior, verbal behavior, and that's always preceded by a mental intention or motivation. That's why we put almost so much emphasis in generating the correct motivation. Yeah, yeah. So that means that yeah, so we have this contaminated life. Yeah, so of course there's nice things in life. You can enjoy the things in life. There's nothing wrong with enjoying things in life, but don't get attached to it, right? So don't have too many expectations of things that will never be met, because then there's no satisfaction, right? You can just enjoy, and knowing that what you're doing in life is not really the ultimate cause for happiness, right? Yeah, so that's kind of, yeah, how we can live our lives. But then you go a step further and you see, okay, as long as I have karma and afflictions, then I have to suffer. Yeah, so that's what we bring to the next topic, because the most important topic to be understood in the middling scope, right, the wish to be free of samsara and to accomplish nirvana, or a state beyond all forms of suffering. So nirvana is not a place, kind of, you know, you can go or something like that. Yeah, you think you have some nirvana somewhere in Spain or somewhere in UK, or is there nirvana like that? There might a pub, some pubs. They named Nirvana or something like that. There was a pub group called Nirvana even. Yeah, no? Maybe it still exists. Does it still exist? No? No, not anymore, no? No, it's kind of a few decades ago. Yeah. Yeah, my time spent was when I was in the monastery for 20 years. Then I was cut off of all these kind of aspects of Western. Not all of it, but most of it. So then I still think, oh, Nirvana, maybe they still exist, but they're not, no? They split up or something, or died even. Yeah. Impermanence, right? Yeah. So yeah, it's true. You know, even Bruce Lee. You know Bruce Lee? Bruce Lee was this kind of kung fu master, right? Who's so strong, but he also died. Yeah. So that is good for us to remember. Death and impermanence. Yeah, in Spain you can find your own pub group, and the Spanish name of Nirvana, maybe you have something like that. Yeah. So that means Nirvana is not a place you can go, right? Nirvana is a quality of the mind. That's what Nirvana is, you know. Nirvana is a quality of the mind, meaning that the mind is free of afflictions, you know. If you have a mind that is free of afflictions, a mind that is free of any form of destructive emotions, you know, eventually you can reach that state to have a mind free from all forms of afflictions. And that's what we call nirvana, right? So it's the quality of the mind rather than a place. So you can be like, you know, His Holiness Dalai Lama, abiding in Buddhahood or abiding in nirvana, but being on the planet with a human body, right? So because it's a quality of the mind. Nirvana is a quality of the mind. Yeah, so and both samsara and nirvana are created by the mind. Yeah, so that's why the Buddha put so much emphasis on mental training, yeah, on to train our mind to eliminate over time the afflictions and to go all the way up to nirvana or enlightenment. Yeah, so nirvana means nirvana means liberation for yourself. Yeah, so freedom of afflictions for yourself. That's what we call nirvana, right? Enlightenment means Buddhahood for the benefit of others. Of course, Buddhas are also free of afflictions, right? And on top of that, they have some more qualities, as we're going to discuss later on. You know, so in the middling scope of the Lamrim, you strive to understand samsara, and to understand nirvana, and to eliminate samsara, and to accomplish nirvana. You see, that's what we do in the middling scope of the Lamrim. Yeah, so in the small scope, you create the right conditions to get a precious human rebirth, and with this precious human rebirth, we can accomplish nirvana and enlightenment. Yeah, so then on the middling scope, you contemplate that just having a precious human rebirth by itself and enjoy life as best way you can is not going to lead you to nirvana, right? Because as long as you have karma and afflictions, you have to suffer. So you have to eliminate that. You have to eliminate all afflictions. Yeah, so that's, yeah, okay. So to go to that direction of nirvana, then the Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths. Yeah, so that's kind of the basic teachings of the Buddha. That should be very well understood. So now we go over the Four Noble Truths, yeah, in a brief way, and later on in one model on Samsara and Nirvana, then we go a little bit more in detail on the Four Noble Truths. Yeah. So what does that mean, the Four Noble Truths, right? Meaning that the Buddha said, look, wake up. Your life is not perfect. You still have suffering, you know? So that's again here, we contemplate suffering not to make us depressed, but we contemplate suffering to wake up and do something about a problem. If you have a problem or an issue in life, and you don't want to know about a problem or issue, then you will never solve the problem, right? So it means you have to understand the problem. Yeah, so that's why the Buddha said, look, this is suffering, and then focus upon the body and the mind, right? Means there's a potential for suffering. Yeah, so this is suffering. You should know suffering, the Buddha said. You know? So knowing suffering, what did the Buddha mean by knowing suffering? Is a question. Oh. You should know suffering, the Buddha said. So the Buddha said you shouldn't know that a headache is a headache, or a cold is a cold, or the fever is a fever, and that's, you don't like that, you know. That's very easy to recognize. We don't have to study for that. You know, as soon as we get sick, we want to get better, right? So that's not really the knowing of suffering. When the Buddha said you should know suffering. So then there's another, that's what we call the suffering of, there's three types of suffering. Maybe you can write down if it's new for you. There's three types of suffering, right? Meaning suffering of suffering, like the headache or the fever or COVID or whatever, you know, kind of direct feeling of mental depression is also suffering of suffering, right? Or physical suffering, yeah? So a direct suffering is called the suffering of suffering. It's very easy to recognize, and it's very easy to generate a wish to be free of that. Yeah? Even animals can do that, right? If you try to harm a particular animal, the animal will just escape. Yeah? So they escape because they don't like suffering. Yeah? So everybody can know that aspect of suffering. That's, the Buddha said you should know suffering. He didn't say you should know the suffering of suffering, because that's very easy, you know. So then maybe it's the second one. The second type of suffering is called the suffering of change, right? So that means, for example, when you're hungry, like for example, you're hungry this evening and you're gonna make a super duper dinner, right? And it's already late, yeah. Especially with my Spanish friends, people in the UK, they had already dinner at 6 or something like that, right? Yeah, but the Spanish friends, no, it was too early. Yeah, because they just wake up from the siesta. So they have a little bit late dinner, right? So yeah, so yeah, 9 o'clock something. So you have dinner and then you have a big dinner, not just a little bit, but a big one, because you're very hungry, right? Or, you know, you can imagine you're very hungry and you go for this incredible dinner, and then you put a little bit more, you know, spices in there and a little bit more oil, and then make it a little bit more rich, you know? Yeah. So you have a very rich dinner, and then it's tasty, and then you eat a little bit more, and then what happens? You go to bed and you wake up next morning, what? You're very dull, right? So that means that that the suffering of change is right there, because you had a suffering of hunger, right? Then you eat too much, and then it transforms into suffering. So that's also, we can recognize to a certain extent, right? Yeah, yeah. So, or people, I don't know if people drink. What do they drink? I don't know. If people, sangria, I'm not sure what people drink these days. But if you drink it too much, then I remember when I was young, they do, oh, drinking, nice drinking, and then drink. And then you get a headache, or you have to vomit in the process of drinking, right? You know the feeling? When you were young and a student, and then you think, oh yeah, this is really yeah, because drinking is very important. Because drinking is a part of happiness, you think, right? So then you think, oh, but then it changes into suffering, right? And you drink too much, you get a headache, or you have to vomit, or whatsoever, you know. So, or you fall because you can't walk properly anymore, you know. So that means there's a suffering of change, right? If you're hungry, eating too much, or when you know, thirsty, drinking too much. Or, but in this case, yeah. Anyway, so you can relate to that, right? It's kind of the suffering of change. Yeah, that's also not too difficult to understand. Although some people they're struggling with it already. You know, you have to understand if you drink too much, then maybe it's not really very productive. You know, not just water, but you know what I mean, right? Yeah, drinking other things. Yeah. So that means that that's what we call the suffering of change. Yeah, that's the Buddha said. That's also not too difficult to understand. Or when it's too hot, you put on the AC, and then it's too strong and it gets too cold. Yeah, or when it's too cold, you put on the heater, and then it gets too warm. You know, so that means you can relate to that, right? The suffering of change. You know. Yeah, but the Buddha said that's not the real thing to be understood. The real thing to be understood is the all-pervasive compounding form of suffering. Yeah, so that's in Spanish probably also quite a long term, right? Yeah. So it means all-pervasive is the most important aspect there. Yeah, all-pervasive means it pervades everywhere. And so that's a very important aspect. It pervades everywhere in samsara. Wherever you go, you have the all-pervasive form of suffering. So what does that mean, all-pervasive form of suffering? We just already said that the contaminated aggregates of body and mind, right? So the all-pervasive aspect means as long as you have karma and afflictions, you're bound to suffer. Yeah, temporarily we're quite okay. You know, we kind of temporarily in a very okay state, but it's very easy to get sick. Why is it easy to get sick? Because we have the causes to get sick underneath the surface. So those causes to get sick underneath the surface, that's a problem, you see? So that's karma and afflictions. As long as you have karma and afflictions, you have to suffer. That's the insight the Buddha said when he said you should know suffering. The Buddha said not the suffering of suffering or the suffering of change, but the Buddha said you should understand as long as you have karma and afflictions, you have to suffer. Yeah, so that's what we call the all-pervasive form of suffering. Yeah, so that should be known, that should be understood, that as long as you have afflictions, you will suffer. You know, so that's exactly what it means to understand suffering, understand the cause of suffering. Basically, that's what it implies, right? As long as you have afflictions, there's no way out. You have, you know, you're bound to suffer. Yeah. Okay, so that's the three types of suffering in regards with the first noble truth. Yeah, the first noble truth was the truth of suffering, not to make us depressed, but to realize, look, life is not perfect. This is the problem, and you know, maybe you should do something about it. Yeah, to wake up. That's why the Buddha initially taught the truth of suffering. Yeah, not to make us depressed, but to help us see, okay, there's a problem there, and we might better try to solve it before it's creating more trouble. Yeah, that's exactly why the Buddha taught the first noble truth, the truth of suffering. Then the second noble truth, yeah. The second one is the true origin of suffering. Yeah, so if you understand the truth of suffering, then or if you have a problem and you understand the nature of the problem, you might like to know how was this problem caused. So what is the cause of the problem? So in a similar way, the Buddha said, this is suffering, right? And then you should know suffering, referring to the all-pervasive form of suffering, in relation with the cause of suffering, right? So you should know how is suffering caused. What is the cause of the problem? It's very important to understand the cause of the problem. Yeah, so that's exactly what we just talked about, karma and afflictions. Because there's karma and afflictions, because that's why they're suffering. So the cause of suffering is karma and afflictions. Suffering, we just talked about the 3 types of suffering, right? And we also talked about the suffering of birth, sickness, aging, and death, and meeting things you don't like to meet, and never meeting things you like to meet, and never being satisfied. Yeah, they're all aspects of suffering, right? And all those aspects of suffering are caused by the cause of suffering. Noble truth number 2. Yeah, so in a similar way, if you're sick, you have a sickness, you go to the doctor, yeah, or you know, to somebody who can help you. And you think, okay, what's the nature of the sickness? Question number 1. What's the nature of the sickness? Then the doctor says it's this and this and this. Then you want to know the cause of the sickness. So the doctor says this is the cause of the sickness, right? So if you know the nature of the suffering and the cause of suffering, then question number 3 comes in relation with noble truth number 3 is it possible to solve this problem or not? Or you go to the doctor and you ask the doctor, is it possible to get cured or not? Yeah, that's question number 3, right? Is it possible to achieve a state beyond suffering? Yeah, so that's what we call the truth of cessation. Yeah, so the truth of cessation, right? The noble truth number 3, meaning what kind of cessation? Means the absence of afflictions. Is it possible to have a mind that is beyond afflictions? To have a mind that is separated from afflictions? Have a mind that has abandoned afflictions? Is it possible or not? Yeah, is it possible to achieve nirvana? That's the question. Yeah, so that means you have a problem, you know the cause of the problem, and then the next question is, question number 3, is it possible to solve the problem? If it's not possible to solve the problem, we can leave the Zoom meeting because then we're wasting our time here, right? So that means if suffering cannot be eliminated, meaning if the cause of suffering cannot be eliminated, the afflictions, if you can eliminate the afflictions, then we're wasting our time here, right? We might as well just leave the meeting and try to enjoy life the best way we can. But luckily, it's possible to eliminate afflictions. Yeah, and why? Because we talked about previously quite on a regular basis. Yeah, we talked about a few times that the destructive emotions are not the innate part of the mind, right? And the destructive emotions are temporarily there by power of causes and conditions, which you can change. Yeah, so you can change the mind. Yeah, and also the destructive emotions are not in accordance with reality. So with a correct form of understanding reality, you can eliminate afflictions. You see? So there's various reasons why it's possible to eliminate afflictions. But even a more profound reason is that the reason that ignorance can be taken away. Yeah, so we just talked about the cause of suffering being karma and afflictions, right? That's the direct cause of suffering. The direct cause of suffering are karma and afflictions. The root cause of suffering is ignorance, right? So the root cause of suffering is ignorance. Yeah. So there's ignorance. If you can take away ignorance, then you can take away all forms of afflictions. Yeah? And ignorance is a mind that is not in accordance to reality, that thinks about an I and mine existing from its own side. But if you examine, there's no I to be found like that in your body or in your mind, you know, or separate from your body and your mind. We come to this in great detail later on in the model on emptiness, you know. So that means, to summarize, the truth of cessation proves it's possible to eliminate these afflictions, because they're not the innate part of the mind, they're just temporary by causes and conditions, which you can play with, and if you understand reality, you can eliminate them because they're not in accordance with reality. Yeah, so that proves the truth of cessation. It is possible to eliminate afflictions. Okay, so you back to the doctor, you see the nature of the sickness, then you know the cause of the sickness, then the doctor says, yes, there's a treatment, you can get cured, right? Or first he says, you can get cured. Yeah, it's possible to get cured. And we see, oh, it's possible to eliminate afflictions. So then question number 4 will be, how do you do that? Or to the doctor, what is the treatment? You know? So then the Buddha said, the treatment is the true paths. Yeah? Noble truth number 4. So that means by the true method, you will be able to eliminate the cause for suffering. You know, we already talked about how to eliminate destructive emotions in the first model a little bit, right? So you can see there's a method that helps us to eliminate afflictions, and that leads us to what we call a cessation or an absence of afflictions. Yeah, so it's a very logical reasoning, right? The Buddha said, look, there's suffering, there's a cause of suffering, yeah, noble truth number 2, and it's possible to have the cessation or the absence of the suffering, noble truth number 3, and how you do that will depending on noble truth number 4, the true paths or the true methods. Yeah, so that's kind of the most essential teachings of the Buddha. It can be all summarized in the 4 noble truths, you know. Yeah. So that means the suffering. We discussed the 3 types of suffering, right? The suffering of suffering, the suffering of change, and the all-pervasive suffering, yeah, being karma and afflictions. As long as you have karma and afflictions, you're stuck. Yeah, you have to suffer. And then the true cause, right? Noble truth number 2 are karma and afflictions. Karma and afflictions directly cause suffering, but ignorance is the root. Remember, I think in the first model I told you, okay, let's see if this ignorance is really the root or not. Remember? I think I asked you to get angry in 3 seconds. I said 1, 2, 3, get angry now. Yeah, and then it was quite difficult. But then I said, oh, look at your hair, or look at your headphone, or look at what you have in your room behind you. Look at what you're doing with your hands. So look at what you do here, what you do that. So then people say, oh, then the eye comes up, and then it's very easy to how dare Namdak say this to me, you know? And then eye comes up, you get angry like that, very easily. So that means it's all rooted in a concept of an ignorance that think there's a very from its own side existing I there. Yeah, same when we want an object, we think I need this, I need that. You know, so that's very rooted in a concept of I and mine. Yeah, so that's what we call this ignorance. Yeah, that's the root of all afflictions. And because of ignorance, we have these afflictions, and then we engage in negative behavior. Yeah, so then the Buddha said, okay, first of all, practice morality, so don't engage in negative behavior, and then train your mind, right? So that means transform your mind to get less these destructive emotions coming up, and then eventually eliminate these afflictions. Yeah, so that's more or less a kind of a summary of what we call the middle scope of the Lam Rim, right? The first 2 truths, the truth of suffering and the true cause of suffering, explains samsara, right? How we are cycling around in samsara because we have karma and afflictions, which is rooted in ignorance, and that's we just cycle around in this cycle. Yeah. So the first 2 truths, yeah, the true truth of suffering and the true origin of suffering, actually explain samsara, right? The last 2 truths, the true paths and the true cessation, explains how to get out of samsara and actually explains how to achieve nirvana. Yeah, so that means that with the last 2 truths, you can achieve nirvana. Because we just talked about true cessation, right? Truth number 3, which has been accomplished by the true method or the true paths. So true cessation is what we call nirvana. right? So the truth of cessation, the ultimate cessation, is what we call nirvana. And we accomplish that nirvana by depending on the true paths. Yeah, noble truth number 4. So you can see the last 2 truths is about nirvana, and the first 2 truths is about samsara. Yeah, so that means in the middling scope, you contemplate the suffering of samsara and the benefits of nirvana, and then you apply the methods to eliminate samsara and to accomplish nirvana, right? Because we talked about last week, we talked, was last week? The week before that, remember we talked about the 3 principal aspects of the path: renunciation, bodhicitta, and emptiness. Yeah, so renunciation is the motivation of the middling scope. Yeah, so that means a wish to abandon samsara and accomplish nirvana, right? That's what we call renunciation. The real renunciation is not, oh, my life is so difficult, I have real renunciation now because I don't like this difficulty. That's not real renunciation. The real renunciation is understanding this all-pervasive form of suffering, right? And wanting to be free of that. Yeah, so that's kind of the real aspect of what we call renunciation. Yeah, so that means the 4 Noble Truths helps us to understand samsara, the first 2 truths, and the last 2 truths helps us to understand nirvana. Yeah, so that's kind of the summary, so to say, or the topic I was planning to discuss today, yeah, in regards with the middling scope of the Lamrim, meaning a wish to accomplish nirvana, and to accomplish nirvana, and to accomplish that you have to abandon samsara, right? So you have to abandon afflictions. Yeah, so that's kind of what we call the middling scope of the Lamrim, a wish of renunciation, or a wish to achieve liberation, or a wish to achieve nirvana, yeah, by contemplating the suffering of samsara, yeah, and having a strong wish not to have this suffering of samsara again and again and again, yeah, the contaminated aspect of birth, sickness, aging, and death beyond our control. We don't like that anymore. The more we contemplate beyond control, to suffer mentally or physically, the more you contemplate, the more stronger the wish comes to be free of that, and then you follow the last 2 truths to get out of it, to achieve nirvana, right? So you generate this motivation of renunciation, wanting to eliminate the first 2 truths and want to accomplish nirvana, meaning want to accomplish the last 2 truths. Yeah, and that's actually what it's all about in the middling scope, yeah, to accomplish nirvana and abandon samsara. Yeah, so that brings us 2 to 8. Yeah, so that's already a little bit getting late, but yeah, what to do. Yeah, so yeah, that's the topic of this evening. And then if there's any questions for the English-speaking audience and with the Spanish friends, we meet not next week, but the week after, right? And then I meet with my Spanish friends to discuss these things, and yeah, dharma and non-dharma, we sometimes say. Yeah, yeah, okay.
Thank you, Geshe. Thank you for your teachings. Sarah, would you got your hand up first? Would you like to unmute yourself and maybe put your video on so that Geshe can see you and ask your question?
Yes, hi, and thank you, Geshe. I've got 2 cheeky questions to squeeze in. It was just the first one was around this kind of fear of these suffering in these other realms driving you on to kind of seeking nirvana and to move away from suffering. And it's the idea as you go down the path, that fear almost turns into compassion for people in those or beings in those realms, and it almost starts off as quite a selfish, maybe individual thing, turns into something that's for much more bigger and for selfless thing. And then there was just another question. I've got a very old dog that I know is going to die soon, and I'm trying to do things to prepare because I know I'm going to be sad about it. I didn't know if you had any practical suggestions of things to do to start preparing for that. Thank you.
So the first question, of course, in the Lamrim, it's a gradual process, right, of mind training. So that means that first, if you understand suffering yourself well, and you generate a wish to be free of that suffering, it's easier to generate a wish for others. Right? So first, we have to be really convinced about the suffering ourselves and generate a wish to be free of it. Yeah? And then, later on, as we're going to discuss in the next week, then we generate compassion, because compassion is a wish for others to be free of suffering. Yeah, so the more you understand suffering, the stronger the wish will become. So that's why we say you have to do the middling scope in order to progress in the great scope. Yeah, so in the middling scope, you imagine yourself you're suffering, because it makes it more intense, and a wish for yourself to be free. Yeah? So that becomes a very strong wish, and then later on you generate compassion. It becomes stronger. So that's a kind of a sequence, right? That's one aspect. Another aspect is, initially we have a motivation to become a Buddha in a Lamrim, right? But then we contemplate a motivation in accordance with the middling scope. That means not a motivation of the middling scope. Because eventually we want to become a Buddha, but in order to increase our compassion, we have to understand suffering. And for that purpose, we contemplating the middling scope, right? So we have a motivation in accordance with the middling scope, but not of the middling scope, you see? So that's a kind of a difference in terminology also in the Lamrim. Because without understanding suffering yourself, how can you generate a wish for others, right? That's very important. So in that context, we contemplate it again and again. Then we really want to get out of it ourselves, and then we generate compassion. Then the compassion becomes stronger. Yeah? Yeah, is that clear? Yeah. So then for your dog, I don't know how big the dog is, but you can you can do various things. You know, you can whisper mantras in the ear, or you know, there's also on the you can get oral transmissions on the internet from Lama Zopa Rinpoche, for example, Golden Light Sutra, or you know, play close to the ears of the dog. You know, so those kind of things. Then, when the dog is still capable of walking, you can have a table a bit higher up, respectful. You put a text of the Lamrim or you know, some holy object of a stupa or Buddha image, or all three together, right? And then you take the dog around that you know, that kaza, because then it causes you know to have imprints. Because if you go around a holy object, you know, you create a cause for enlightenment, if you want it or not, you know. So that's very precious, you know. So that means there's a few things you can do, yeah. Whisper mantras in the ears, or play in kind of chanting, or play these kind of transmissions, yeah. The Golden Light Sutra transmission you can find online of Lama Zopa Rinpoche, and then playing close to the dog, right, and then lead the dog when it can still walk around, you know, around a holy object. Yeah, so there's a few things you can do. Yeah? Okay?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Geshe. Jeff, would you like to go next and ask your question and mute?
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Gueshe. So I've seen obviously that the cause of suffering is karma. Well, when I say I've seen it, what I really meant is I've heard it. I haven't directly seen it. But the cause of suffering is karma and afflictions. Now, from this, I can see that, or can try to understand that karma is negative. But is there possibility that there's a kind of neutral or positive karma? I'm a bit confused about that. Yes.
Good question. Yeah, because I didn't explain that in detail, because there's one model about karma coming up, right? So I didn't.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, to make it a little bit clear, karma can be positive, negative, or neutral.
Okay.
So then for the lower realms, it's negative karma. For suffering, it's negative karma, right? For experience happiness, it's positive karma. But the good things we do, like generosity, yeah, you make an offering to an organization or whatsoever, right? Which is something virtuous, but it's contaminated in the sense that we still grasp towards an I, or, you know, a kind of I and mine, you know? So that means it is a contaminated form of positive karma, which will ripen in contaminated happiness. Yeah, we just talked about the all-pervasive compounding form of suffering and the suffering of change, right? So actually all forms of contaminated happiness, so the good things we do within samsara is motivated by ignorance, right? So because it's motivated by ignorance, the cause is contaminated, so the result will be contaminated. Although we experience some happiness of the good things we've done, but it's still not everlasting, right? It changes. So that's why we say the contaminated happiness we experience is actually in the nature of the suffering of change, because it's not everlasting. We do good things, but it's always mixed and motivated with ignorance, and that's why it's contaminated in the result as well. And it means that there's never really an everlasting happiness in our life, you know? Yeah. So there's positive, negative, and neutral karma. We go in great detail to that in the model on karma, right? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Geshe. And finally, Abelardo, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question? Maybe lower your hand as well.
Thank you very much. Yes. Thank you once again, Gueshe. My question is related to the point that about ignorance, the fundamental ignorance, believing in the existence of the mind, you said, from its own side. And what confused me is that in a previous class, I had asked you a related question about the continuum of consciousness. It goes on from one life to another in this subjective, be it empty, but a subjective, it's consciousness. So isn't that a kind of existence on one's own side, but yet, vacuous, I understand, at the same time?
So there's a continuity of consciousness, right? But the continuity of consciousness is just a mere collection of moments of a particular stream of consciousness, right? So that means that there is no from its own side existing consciousness at all. There's no from its own side existing individual moments, because if they're from the own side existing individual moments, they can never relate with each other, right? So that means there's interdependence all the way through. No moments exist from their own side. There's no consciousness that exists from its own side. There's no consciousness that exists inherently or without dependence. It's the constant flux of coming and going, right? And because that constant flux of coming and going, that's exactly why cause and effect is possible. Because if the cause exists by its own side, it can never meet conditions for the ripening of the result. Yeah, so that means everything is dependent upon something else than itself, right? So a cause or moment of consciousness depends on an object or depends on a previous moment of consciousness, right? And in a similar way, everything always depends on something else than itself. Yeah, so a cause depends on conditions to bring a result, right? So that means there's a constant interdependence. That means that nothing can exist from its own side. And that's what we're meaning here. But from its own side existing self, or from its own side existing consciousness, that cannot exist in that way, because everything is interdependent, and everything is in the nature of dependence. Dependence on something else than itself, right? So because things are dependent on something else than itself, things cannot exist by their own, from their own side. That's what I mean here. Yeah, so that means there's a conventional person who, based upon the mere collection of the body and mind, right? There's a conventional person there, right? Yeah. There's a conventional Abelardo, right? So that means, that conventional Abelardo, he engaged in thinking, he engaged in verbal expression, he engaged in physical behavior, right? So all those moments of physical, verbal, and mental activity, right, they leave potentials in your continuity for ripening in the future. Same if you look at a screen, you close your eyes, as we just did, you can remember exactly what's on the screen, because that information is not lost of having seen the screen. In a similar way, what we have said in the past, what we have done physically in the past, that information is not lost. That is kind of, it came to an end at a particular time, the activity ceased to exist, but it left a potential in a continuity, right? So that can be remembered, or that can cause a particular result to come about. And that's exactly what we talk about. In karma, is within the continuity, there's a cause and effect relationships of physical, verbal, and mental activity. And that comes to ripening by depending on causes and conditions. So that means nothing exists from its own side, because everything is depending on something else in itself to move in this progress, or this process of coming and going and meeting causes and conditions to either come to ripening or not yet, or come to ripening later on. Yeah? Does that make sense or not?
Yeah, I think that the problem is linguistic, perhaps. By using the term continuum of consciousness, it connotes something of a permanent nature, although I understand that its nature is impermanent. But yeah, it's a bit paradoxical, maybe.
This means everlasting, right? So everlasting in the sense, the continuity is everlasting of the stream of consciousness, meaning clear and knowing aspect, right? So that means there's no from its own side existing continuity, there's no from its own side existing clear knowing aspect, right? Because everything depends on things other than themselves. But there is a mere continuity without a beginning and without an end, right? So that mere continuity of moments is there. So try to think in the continuity of consciousness in a similar way as we explained the river before, remember? That there's snow melting, that becomes little streams, that goes into a river, and it goes into a lake, right? So if you sit close to the lake, you say, oh, this is the river, then that water molecule might already be in the lake. It's not a river anymore. So what we call river, there's something there, right? What we call river, but actually if you look for it, you cannot really pinpoint it, because everything is dependent. It's not individual, this is the river and that's it, right? It's just, there is water flowing there, for sure, right? But what it actually is, the river is just based on time and location. We say, oh, this is the river, right? It's just imputed. So same for our continuity of consciousness, from the morning you woke up until the present time, is a continuity which is just merely labeled, because the moment you say, oh, this is it, then already the next moment is coming to being, right? So you cannot have from its own side existing consciousness as such. It's just a mere label based upon individual moments, and those individual moments exist, right? Otherwise you cannot label it as such. Yeah, so that's a few things for you to think about in relation with the river, and label according to time and location. Then think about consciousness in a particular time period and see the kind of, it's a similar kind of aspect. Yeah, the contemplation.
But even the clear light has a continuity of kind. The clear light.
Similar, right? Clear light is the most subtle aspect of consciousness, but also has no beginning and no end. Yeah. So the clear light is also, you know, it's not something that exists from its own side, because we can make it manifest when it's dormant if you do certain practices, and now it's always dormant. When you die, it becomes manifest because of the dying process. So it's also coming and going, right? It's not something that exists from its own side. Yeah, yeah. So it's the same. It's also continuity, but that continuity is sometimes more dormant and sometimes more manifest. Yeah, same with any form of consciousness. Yeah. Yeah.
I just want to finally share a simile that I have learned, which I think it helps me understand, which is in a movie theater, the projecting of the light, and then each frame of a film is like a life, and so you know, yeah, a certain life. And so so the light is like a clear light. That would be part of the simile, and each life would be a frame of the picture, which is changing. Yeah.
I mean, it's just there's a different explanation because that's of the Vajrayana practice, right? In the Vajrayana practice, we talk about the clear light, the most subtle mind and the most subtle energy is what goes from this life to the next life, and that carries that mere collection, or the mere imputed aspect of that collection carries all these kind of imprints, right? So it's a very similar aspect as the mere continuity in the sutra system. Yeah, so it's just a continuity that carries all the imprints from this to the next life. And then, because same thing, when you go to sleep, the clear-eyed mind dawns very, very briefly. We hardly recognize it, and then the dream comes, and then we wake up. It's very similar to dying. Then also when you fall asleep, sensory perception stops, and the clear light mind becomes more manifest, right? So that's very similar, and then you have the dream is very similar to the bardo, and then the rebirth is very similar to waking up. So there's a very similar kind of similarities between, you know, the clear light of the sleep and the clear light of death, and yeah, anyway, that's there's something to be talked about later. Yeah, that falls.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, hi, Shotandra. Okay, all right.
Thank you, Abelardo. Thank you, Geshe-la. Yeah, there's no more questions, I don't think, Geshe-la.
Easy evening. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. And then we do the few dedications because we just talked about accumulating kasa morality and making a prayer is a kind of is a cause for good rebirth, right? So in a similar way, if you make prayers or dedications, you know, so dedication means by the power of this virtue I've created today by contemplating the Four Noble Truths, for example, right? May this and this come about. So we make a prayer in the form of a dedication, and then for the spreading of these teachings, right? And all beings quickly achieve state of enlightenment, and for bodhicitta and emptiness to be realized, right? So that's, if you do that again and again, you create more causes for that to happen. Yeah, okay? Okay. Dagi jine sabe gewa di tendang dowa gyunang. Geba jetsen lozan drapa. Tembe ningbo ringdu zelje jo. May the glorious life be long and stable. May all beings equal in space and happiness. And may I and others, without exception, accumulate merit and purify negativities. And may we be blessed to quickly attain Buddhahood. Janjo semjo rinpoche magye panang gegyu chik. Geba nyamba meba yang. Gone gonde belwa sho toni tawa rinpoche. Magye panam gegyu chik. Geba nyamba meba. Gone gonde belwa sho. Yeah, okay, also pray for the members of Jamyang to be better soon. So then next week, for those who would like to come in the temple, then they can come again, because, yeah, probably okay by next week, I suppose. But yeah, also pray for that, right? Yeah, okay, thank you so much, and good evening, good night, and yeah, see you next week. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Geshe-la. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Take care, yeah?
Thank you, Geshe-la. Thank you, staff.
Thank